this morning. I know this is going to be tough for some of you to take. I've got some hard news. I know many of you look at me over the years and you're like, gosh, that guy just hasn't aged in 15 years. And I know that some of you aspire to this. You see it as the physical peak of what you could do. And in the last few weeks, I've made it 44 years. I've avoided this with my life. It's been a sense of pride. And eventually, a couple weeks ago, about 4 weeks ago, I had to go in and was broken down. And so journey this morning, you're going to see something. It's going to be pretty shocking. But I am now among those of you that wear these. Yeah, it's been tough. I'll put them on when I read. But I went in to see Dr. Hopkins here in town, and it was actually kind of funny. Like, I don't need them. I'm farsighted, so I'm not supposed to wear them like when I drive or everyday life, but I need them when I read, and I had noticed that I had started needing them. And so you go in, and you guys have been to the eye doctor, most of you, and he's got the little chart, and you look at it, and I'm like, yeah, I can read that. And we're going through the things where he goes, number 1, number 2, number 4, number 735, and like all these things, and it's the same chart, right? But then like at one point, I'm like, I think I'm fine. Like, I think it's fine. And he goes, well, let me show you something. So he puts this chart up, and I'm looking through the little thing, and he's like, can you read that? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, so now look at this. And he pops his, he goes, flick. And it's like, whew. And I'm like, oh, that's way better. And he goes, yeah, the first one is what you see, like now. The second one is if you would actually put on glasses, moron. Yeah, I'm real good friends with Dr. Hopkins, as you can tell. But it was incredible to me that when you go and you get in that little machine, that like it's the same thing all the time, and he flicks these things, and that like one moment like I can't see anything, the next moment it's super clear, and all these things, but it's always the same chart. Well, this morning I'm gonna have to wear them a lot because we're gonna read a bunch of scripture this morning. And as we go through and continue this series in the Gospel of Luke, as we look at the last moments of Jesus' life, what's incredible to me is in our text today, we're going to see 6 different people. 6 people who encounter Jesus, the same Jesus every time. And yet, they always see something different. They all see the same person. He's the unchanging element in our story. He never changes. He's the same person in every encounter, and yet all 6 of these people see Jesus through a different clouded set of eyes. And so we're going to start in Luke 22. I know they look good, right? And we're going to start in chapter 22, and we're going to start in verse 66. It says, when day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, the chief priests, the scribes. They led Jesus away to their council, and they said, if you are the Christ, then tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you won't believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. So they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, well, you say that I am. And then the council said to him, what further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips. Now this Jewish council that's talking to Jesus, they're the religious leaders of his day. They're the people who are supposed to be looking for Jesus to come. And yet when the council sees Jesus in front of them, all they see is a threat. See, this council is asking questions that they really don't want to hear or take in the truth on. They want answers that will convict Jesus of a crime, when the answers Jesus is giving them should actually have been convicting them. When this council of religious leaders looks at Jesus, all their vision is clouded. All they see is a threat to their way of life, a challenge to their power, a threat to their money, a threat to their control and their leadership. They look at Jesus and all they see is somebody who can take everything they think is important away. See, this council's identity, well, it's found in their power. It's found in being right no matter the cost. And So it clouded their vision, and all they saw in Jesus was a threat to their way of life. Clearly, seeing Jesus for who he was would have changed their way of life. And they didn't have eyes to see that. See, when power and position and being right at all costs is what's most important to us, then when we see Jesus, all we see is a threat to maybe change our way of life. Now, this council of Jewish leaders, they would have actually killed Jesus right there if they could, but the problem was they were under the thumb of the Roman government, and so they weren't allowed to do executions, to carry out death sentences themselves. So they take him to a Roman prefect, the leader of the Roman government, a guy named Pontius Pilate, and we pick that up in chapter 23. It says, the whole company of them arose, and they brought Jesus before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, and they said, we found this man misleading our nation, forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he is actually Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, he said, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said, you've said so. Well, then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, he says, I don't find any guilt in this man. But the crowd was urgent, and it said, he stirs up the people. He teaches throughout all Judea from Galilee even to this place. Now over in verse 18, it says, they all cried together. He left, and now he's brought back to Pilate. And they say, away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection started in the city and for murder. Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, crucify him, a third time. Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? I have found no guilt in this man, no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and I'll release him. But they were urgent. They demanded with loud cries that Jesus should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand would be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, and he delivered Jesus over to their will. Now, I think Pilate's one of the most fascinating people in all of Scripture. I always feel like Pilate genuinely and honestly, sometimes desperately wanted to get out of this. He doesn't know what to do with Jesus. See, Pilate sees Jesus, and when he looks at Jesus, all he sees is a conundrum. He sees a question that he can't figure out, a problem that he can't solve. It feels like Pilate knows that Jesus is innocent. It feels like Pilate knows that he didn't do any of these things, but Pilate also knows that if he goes against this mob, and that he's going to lose his position of power and maybe even his life. In John 18, when John describes this conversation, he says that Pilate says to Jesus, so you're a king? And Jesus says, well, you say I'm a king. And for this purpose I was born. For this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. And Pilate says, well, what is truth? Pilate goes down in history. I thought this was fascinating. Pilate goes down in history as a person who tried Jesus 3 times, declared him not guilty all 3 times, and still sent him to death the same. Pilate openly says Jesus is innocent, and yet he allows Jesus to die. Pilate asks Jesus questions over and over again, and Scripture says Pilate even was afraid of the answers that Jesus was giving. But the truth never seemed to penetrate Pilate's heart enough to change his life. See, Pilate's identity was found in his position, but it was dictated by what people around him thought. It clouded his vision. All Pilate could see when he saw Jesus is, if I do this for Jesus, the people are going to be angry. All Pilate saw was confusion of how he could keep his position and follow Jesus. How could he keep the people happy and also do the right thing? See, clearly seeing Jesus would have meant that Pilate would have had to go against the crowd. And he just wasn't willing to do that. See, when our life is wrapped up in what other people think, when it's wrapped up in being liked or keeping a position or making sure we maintain a certain social status, it clouds our vision of Jesus, and Jesus becomes a problem. He becomes a conundrum because we can't figure out how to live for the world and for Jesus. And so Pilate actually sends Jesus in the middle of that story to a guy named Herod. He heard Jesus mention Galilee, so he sends him. He tries to pawn him off. He sends him to Herod, and Herod is the guy in Scripture, if you remember, that he beheaded John the Baptist because he had his, let's get this right, he had his wife's daughter dancing provocatively in front of him. And so he got all overcome with emotion. He said, whatever you want, I'll give you. And she said, chop off John the Baptist's head. That's Herod. And Pilate sends him to him. And in verse 8, it says, when Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign or miracle done by him. See, Herod is this guy that lives in the moment. He is all about right now. He doesn't care about tomorrow. His mouth writes checks that his butt can't cash. And when Herod sees Jesus, all he sees is a sideshow. It's the circus that came to town. Herod wants to see a spectacle. He wants pleasure right now. He wants to see Jesus do tricks, and he wants to see these miracles and these healings and all these things. And when Jesus doesn't do that, Herod has no use for him. Because Herod looks at Jesus and just thinks, well, this will be fun. Bible scholar Thabiti Anaboile says this. He says, Herod shows us that it's actually possible for a human being to be so jaded that they can stand face to face with Jesus and feel absolutely nothing. Herod is indifferent to Jesus once he finds out that Jesus isn't going to do anything he wants. See, Herod is this guy whose identity was found in living for the moment. He was the pleasure of life guy. Live today because tomorrow you might die. And it clouded his vision, and all he saw when Jesus entered the room was another possible moment of enjoyment. And when he didn't get it, he had no use for Jesus. When he wasn't satisfied in that instant, then he didn't care. See, Herod lived for the moment. Whatever feels good, you just do it. And clearly seeing Jesus for who he actually was, for who he was, would have meant that Herod would have had to go deep for once in his life. He would have had to get beyond the superficial surface. It would have meant giving up some temporary pleasure for lasting fulfillment. And Herod, he didn't have eyes for that. See, when Jesus really stands before us, it draws us deeper. It takes us beyond superficial, how's the weather? And if all you and I care about is the moment, if it's what gives us the most temporary pleasure, if we don't want to think about the consequences of decisions, then we can't see Jesus for who he clearly is. Well, our text goes on. Pilate delivers Jesus over to be crucified. And in verse 32, Jesus is actually led up the hill on the way to the cross. He is convicted. He is beaten within an inch of his life. He has a crossbeam strapped to his shoulders, and he is told to walk up the hill to where he will die. And in verse 32, it says there were two others who were criminals who were led away to be put to death with Jesus. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, they were crucified. There they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots, and they divided his garments. And the people stood by watching, but the rulers, they scoffed at Jesus. They said, he saved others, let him save himself. If he's the Christ of God, his chosen one, save himself. The soldiers mocked him, and they came up and offered him sour wine. And they said, if you're really the king of the Jews, then save yourself. There was an inscription over Jesus that said, this is the king of the Jews. And one of the criminals who was hung railed at Jesus. He said, are you not the Christ? Save yourself and save us. But the other criminal rebuked him. And he said, don't you fear God? You're under the same sentence of condemnation, and we He says, we indeed justly, we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man, this Jesus, he's done nothing wrong. And he said to Jesus, he said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. See, the first criminal saw Jesus and he was mad. The first criminal was fearful of death, and he looked at Jesus and he's like, if you're really who you say you are, then why don't you start doing it? He says, Jesus, if you're actually who you say you are, then get me off the cross. Fix my temporary solution. Do what I want right now. And if Jesus couldn't give him what he wanted in the moment, if he wasn't going to fix his problem, then he had no use for Jesus. And all he saw in Jesus was a failure. Someone who wouldn't fix the things that he thought needed fixing. He had no use for Jesus. See, the first criminal's identity, his life was all about his earthly life and all about his selfish desire to live another day. And it clouded his vision. So all that he saw Jesus in a predicament so he could live. A way out of what was going on in that moment. A genie in a bottle who could grant that wish. Seeing Jesus for who he actually was would have meant the criminal had to admit who he actually was. He was that he was deserving what he got, and that he didn't deserve what Jesus could give. He had to realize that he had no reason to ask for Jesus to help him out, but he couldn't see that. He looked beyond his immediate life. He looked beyond his own selfish need. He looked at Jesus, squarely at the crucified Christ. An innocent man who was getting the same punishment as he was. And for the first time in our story this morning, somebody starts to see clearly. He saw Jesus as the hope of the world and his salvation. See, I think death has a way of doing that to you, right? Like the closer we get to death, or when death comes knocking on our door, it becomes very real, or the doctor tells us something we don't want to hear, or our life gets a little closer to the back end than the front.